At this voice level, volume level, can you hear me back there? All right, all good? All right, thank you. Again, my name is Andrew Rister. I'm an extension specialist with the University of Maryland Extension. I have an office at Y Research and Education Center. And I've been working on this hemp project for quite some time now, even though Maryland only passed the law back in 2018 and our first growing season was 2019. This process has been long coming in Maryland because they started the law making back in 16. But Maryland finally, the legislature got it together. They were able to pass the hemp pilot program. MDA made the regulations to it last year around this time. And the Farm Bill then came out, the 2018 Farm Bill. We'll talk a little bit about how that's going to affect growers next year. But primarily, the hemp pilot program was primarily to work with growers who were interested in producing hemp, and there was some regulations based around that, which I'll discuss. I want to acknowledge Nicole Ferrolino. She was my partner in this whole process, an invaluable source of knowledge and help, because with the partnership program, took a lot of our time and a lot of effort. Not only that, but we had a number of our county educators who were out there doing hands-on work with our partners. So let me get on with this project here. What we're growing is varieties of cannabis sativa with some indica mix in them, and that's a picture of industrial hemp, and this is a picture of medical marijuana, and you notice it's the same species mix of cannabis, sativa, and indica. There are various amounts of indica in this cannabis sativa species hybrid. Some have a little more, some have a little less. Primarily, we'll get into the different varieties, but note that they're pretty much both the same as far as species go. The definition between them, the issues that we're actually looking at is the psychoactive phytochemical called tetra-hydracannabinol, or delta-9 tetra-hydracannabinol. And that creates the legal difference between industrial hemp and marijuana, if you want to call it that. So that definition comes down to the amount of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol in the plant, and any part of the plant by dry mass can be no more than 0.3% delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That is the federal law. That is the state law. If you're growing anything with a higher delta-9 than that, then it is considered marijuana and illegal. So obviously from that we focused on industrial hemp. And this research that we've been doing over the past year with our partners and at our research station, Y Research and Education Center, is focused on this in this variety of cannabis, industrial hemp. Okay, so what's the big deal about hemp? Well, heck, there's 50,000 uses for it. There's got to be some value in it, the profit. I've seen 20,000 uses. I've seen 50,000 uses. There are a lot of uses for it. I'm not sure if it exceeds more than 10, but 10,000 uses. But obviously, there are some very interesting products that can be made from industrial hemp. And there's a big push in the United States, and has been for quite some time, to get this back in our agricultural fields. Legal chronology. So back in the pre-1700s, our colonists were the colonists here were growing hemp for the British Navy. And it wasn't, they were, I wouldn't say, maybe not legally bound. I'm not sure how the British, the homeland basically wanted to work with the colonists, but they were really pretty much instructed to grow this hemp for the Navy. And there's a lot of kind of research and background into all of that production. It was our money was printed on the fiber, the paper that was made from hemp, and it was a cash crop for quite some time. Birdseed industry, the fiber industry, and such. But in 1937. The legislature in the United States, the federal government decided to make cannabis illegal. And according to Jimmy Buffett, since all the jazz musicians were smoking it, I guess the federal government didn't want them playing much jazz. So what happened was the cannabis, or hemp, was then being imported from the Philippines after 1937. You could get a stamp to grow it, but primarily most of our hemp was being imported from the Philippines after that. So all the jazz musicians went to the Philippines, I guess. Then what happened in 1941, December 7th? Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese pretty much cut off all the supply lines from our Manila hemp. So the federal government started getting our growers, our farmers, to start growing hemp for victory. And it was needed by our Navy. And it came back as another crop that was, that became important for the war effort. In the 40s. And then you can saw that last slide, or actually with this, what was it, right here, this tax stamp. It expires June 30th, 1946. So growers could still continue growing the hemp, but they had to pay a tax on it. And by 1952, in the 50s, the synthetic materials like nylon and rayon were being created, and it pretty much destroyed the hemp industry, other than birdseed, and even that was being cut out at the time. Then in 1970, the Controlled Substance Act was created, and it completely made cannabis sativa illegal. It was considered a Schedule I drug without any use whatsoever. And that thereby ended any potential production of hemp in the United States up until 2014, where the Agricultural Act of 2014, the Farm Bill, pretty much brought hemp back under very strict regulatory circumstances. It was called the pilot program, and states that chose to become involved could legislate production of hemp. Their Department of Agriculture could regulate that, and it was all under the auspice of research. So growers would have to become certified and regulated by their Departments of Agriculture, and they would have to work with their Department of Agriculture or an institution of higher education to grow it. In 2018, Maryland developed their pilot program law, and MDA developed the regulations around that. And at the end of 2018, the 2018 Farm Bill had the Hemp Farming Act in it, and it took cannabis sativa, industrial hemp cannabis sativa, off the Controlled Substance Act. So that opened up commerce, interstate commerce for the crop. So we've come a long way since '37. The federal law basically created that regulated program. You get a certification from the state, you work with an institution of higher education, and you can possess and grow industrial hemp for research purposes. And in Maryland and many other states, you could actually process the hemp, create products out of it, and sell those products. And again, with the MDA, the Maryland Department of Agriculture regulations, there was a certificate given out, so a $250 fee, so long as you had a contract with an institution of higher education. And in 2019, which was our first hemp year in Maryland, we had 65 partners. Hood College, Frostburg University, Garrett Community College, Morgan State, Salisbury, UMES, University of Maryland College Park, a couple others were all joined in this process, and growers signed up under these institutions of higher education. We had over 1,000 acres of hemp production in Maryland. 11 of those 65 were our partners, the University of Maryland College Park partners. And we had them all perform the same research, which I'll get into, and it was primarily to determine the optimal nitrogen rates for the hemp production. Some of these, the greenhouse growers, there were 3 of them, did some phosphorus research for me. So what is research? What were we interested in doing as far as what we considered valid studies for this partnership? Well, our focus was primarily looking at nitrogen rates, so we could develop the nitrogen recommendations for nutrient management plans. What we had already known that Kentucky, Penn State, they had all come out with some information on nitrogen rates for some of the varieties that grew fiber and seed production. And as you can see here in this picture from North Carolina, there's many different varieties that the industrial hemp falls under. And again, some were for fiber, some are for seed, and others are for a phytochemical content. These hemp varieties are selected for their THC content. Make sure they're below 0.3%. Fiber, as I said, seed. And then this very interesting phytochemical called cannabidiol. And there are certain varieties of hemp that are specifically grown for cannabidiol, which is this cannabinoid as a secondary metabolite in the hemp plant. There are the growing systems for CBD hemp is very different than the fiber and grain growing systems. I would say that the CBD hemp is more horticultural in growing systems, and the fiber and grain are more agronomic. The very similar aspects with the CBD production is tobacco and tomatoes. Well, I'll show you a picture of exactly how that system it works out. So what we were interested in doing, and primarily most of the growers in Maryland, were interested in CBD hemp production. So we didn't have a lot of information about the nitrogen requirements for that. So we decided that we would focus on CBD hemp production at our research station. And from that, with all our growers growing CBD hemp, our partners, our 11 partners, we focused primarily on nitrogen rates. We were interested in the requirement and optimum fertilization rate for these CBD crop. We were looking at if that nitrogen rate would affect yield, basically plant growth, fresh mass, flower production, and how would it have an effect on CBD content. And of course, we were also interested to see if these nitrogen rates would influence the THC content. We were very lucky. Our 11 growers were pretty much spread out throughout Maryland. We had some from Wicomico, one from Wicomico, and one from Garrett, one from St. Mary's, and a bunch in between. So it was really nice that we had a nice spread of growers throughout Maryland, that we could get some good information about environment with the research that we were doing. I have to have a call out for all of our extension educators in the counties. They were vital for this process. They were the frontline people working with our growers. Since Nicole and I were based out of Y Research in Queen Anne's County, we weren't able to get out to Garrett County, Washington County as often, so we had our extension educators helping us out, and that was very valuable to us, very valuable. So I want to thank all of them who helped us out this year. As I said before, we were primarily focused with the CBD crop. We did have a grower that was working with seed production. And potentially for food and oil extraction. This is primarily the growing system for CBD hemp. As you can see, raised beds, plasticulture, staked, and irrigation underneath. And it is very similar, as I said, to tomato production. So what were we expecting of our partners? We were interested in them applying separate nitrogen treatments so we could get response curves to get those optimum nitrogen rates for the CBD hemp. We also wanted them to make some anecdotal observations about their production. Primarily, what were you seeing? Integrated pest management or plant management, pests, diseases, anything else that might come up. And we were also asking them for potential anything economic that we could utilize to share with growers for the following year. We asked our growers to apply 4 different nitrogen rates. A base, 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Primarily, we use that as we ask them to just apply 50 pounds of nitrogen throughout the field. And then on top of that, they would then apply 150, 200, and 250 pounds of nitrogen within those rows that they were growing. There are 4 replications, so we could get replicated information, replicated data, so we could do statistics. So our partners needed to at least be able to have 16 experimental plots. And some of these were kind of the requirements in our application process. We were interested in fresh mass. They would cut the plants down at the end of the year. They would weigh them. We were also interested in the amount of that high-quality flower at the top of the plant, colas, or the tails of the plant. These are where the highest quality flowers are. They are very valuable if you can sell them, which I'd like to just quote, "if you can sell them," which is a big issue throughout all of this process. These colas would go for between $50 and $500 per dry pound. Again, depending on who is your buyer and if this buyer would actually pay you. You'd get anywhere between half a pound or 1 pound per plant of these flowers, of which you would harvest between mid and late October for the highest CBD content. We're also interested in the biomass. The biomass is what you strip off those stems. That biomass is being sold and processed to create the CBD concentrates. And you are being paid, as a grower, you are being paid by percent CBD content per pound of that biomass. And I'll get into a little bit of the economics later on as to how that all works out and if it's profitable. So our partnerships, who were able to report to us with limited information, by the time Nicole and I developed this presentation, we had 4 growers, luckily, from all corners of our state. In Wicomico, we had a grower growing on loamy sand, and their end source was ammonium nitrate, which was a soluble that they had put through their irrigation lines. In Garrett County, we had a silt loam, and they had applied everything up front. They did a base 19-19-19 fertilizer on the ground, and then applied their urea in row, just like you had seen with that picture of the raised plasticulture beds. In Washington County, they had a silt loam. Again, their end source was urea, and the same process. They did an initial 50 pounds per acre, and then applied their end source in their row. And in St. Mary's County, sandy loam, and again, the end source was urea with the same process of applying an initial 50 pounds and then the extra nitrogen in row. So the limited amount of information that we were able to get from them was our Wicomico grower primarily sold those flowers, the high-quality flowers, and and I'll give you an information on how much they were able to sell those flowers for. Nicole worked up some graphics to show you what kind of differences we had with our nitrogen rates, and because and this is average cola weight per plant. We add also information on how many colas per plant and total cola weight per plant. I believe there wasn't anything as far as extraordinary when it comes to differences with nitrogen rates. This was the only one that she was able to pull from. And both 50 and 150 pounds of nitrogen gave a significantly higher cola weight than 200, and 250 wasn't any different than 50 and 250, or 200, or sorry, 150. So you're kind of getting a very small shot at the variability of what we had noticed not only with our growers, but with our research, which Nicole will talk about tomorrow. As far as Wicomico County, their fresh weights, no differences in the amount of material, biomass created from the nitrogen treatments. The same thing goes with Garrett County. Our Washington County growers, St. Mary, they also had no differences in production between nitrogen treatments. They had less production because they started late, and Washington County was the same thing. But if you notice, through all of these nitrogen treatments, that this CBD crop seems to be relatively nitrogen efficient. And we weren't getting any differences in production based on that. So are we ready to start saying 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre for CBD production? We still have a lot of data that we want to plow through. And we're not ready to just say that yet. But it is very interesting. This seems to be a relatively nitrogen efficient crop. And so we'll stick with that for the time being. So there are no difference in fresh weight, even by soil type, even by the environment. Western Maryland or Eastern Shore, we didn't have a lot of response with nitrogen rates. Maybe the thing to do is to actually, when we do our CBD crop studies next year, we'll drop it down to 25 pounds of nitrogen per acre to see where we can find that response curve. We do expect some biomass results from our growers. This was just fresh weight of the plants. There is a slight correlation between fresh weight and biomass production. We think from our research that we've seen at Y, and we need to run some more stats with that to really try to tease out some more information to figure out if 50 pounds of nitrogen is right for these plants. We also asked our partners some questions, and two of them were able to respond back to us. What part of the plant did they intend to sell? Primarily, growers were very interested in selling the colas, which was a very high value, and they were also interested in selling the biomass for CBD production. What price were you offered? What price were you offered, and what price you got are two different things. What pests did you observe? I'll discuss that. What was the challenge in growing hemp in your region? The physical characteristics, climate, economic issues, soil, weather, moisture, soil type, access to equipment, any economic challenges, access to equipment. We plan on getting more of this information from our growers as soon as they respond to us, but we haven't had a whole lot of response from them yet. We asked what variety of crop did they grow. We know that there were several varieties being grown out there. We had grown 4 varieties at Y, and they were all CBD varieties. And we wanted to know if you grew those multiple varieties of hemp, did you notice any major differences in the varieties? So with Garrett County, the response was that they grew better than expected out there. I think that our agent, our county educator, Willie Lance, and the grower he was working with were really surprised at how well the crops grew in Garrett County. I think primarily they didn't think that with the cooler temperatures it was going to do as well, but it did very well. The soils that they had were fallow for over 10 years, so there was probably relatively high organic content. And Willie had mentioned that they had good tilth, so I think that was good for root establishment. There was some wet zones in the plots that they had put them in, so those plants didn't do very well because hemp likes relatively moist, well-drained soils. They used straw between the rows for effective weed control, which was something that this grower wanted to be very organic in that sense. Fact is, you couldn't spray anything on the hemp anyways. But I think that just to minimize the amount of labor that in cleaning up the rows, he used straw. It was south-facing, good airflow, and after harvest, they used a lifter to pull the plastic up, and those roots were very substantial, which we've also noticed in our other locations. They were offered $115 for dry pound of those colas. Offered. I don't know if they received that. I have to actually find out if they got those, if they actually sold that crop. And they were offered $3 for each percent point of each percent point of CBD per dry mass, per pound of dry mass. In Wicomico, the colas they sold them for $200 per dry pound. And their biomass was being sold at $26 per pound. Now, how that works out, it depends on what the price it was at the time when they sold it, if they have, and what the CBD content is. And I don't have that information just yet. They noticed cucumber beetle, corn earworm, especially towards the end of the season after the corn was cut. Fusarium crown rot was a big issue with a lot of our growers. Even our growers that weren't working with us, we had got a lot of Fusarium crown rot. I'll show you what that looks like. The problem was as soon as October hit, it started raining on us. It started getting more humid, and it was more difficult to dry the crop. They were cutting them and hanging them in the barn. They did not have a lot of air movement or air circulation or air conditioning in that location that they were hanging and drying the plants. So it was very difficult to dry those plants out. Because they're so heavy and laden with biomass, if they don't dry out quickly, the material will start getting mold. And that's a problem, botrytis and such. The labor was greater than expected. I think for all of us, even on our research station, the amount of labor that goes into harvesting and pulling off that biomass was quite extreme. Anecdotal observations from our growers and from us. What we noticed with disease, insects, and other problems. Our growers were told that this crop is practically bulletproof. They're being told by growers out in Washington State, east of the Cascades, and in Colorado. Both locations were relatively dry. The crop itself likes arid environments. And knowing that where we are in the Mid-Atlantic, something that I say to a lot of my growers who are interested in growing alternative crops, something different, is if you want to know if a plant gets a disease, grow it in Maryland. And hops has been one of those, and hemp has been one of those also. So we were particularly concerned about disease, which came to fruition, and of course with insects, corn earworm, and other particular problems. So first of all, what we noticed, a lot of our growers actually got rooted cuttings from outside of Maryland. And those rooted cuttings came in, and because of the production practices from those other locations outside of Maryland, they were getting a lot of vascular fusarium. So you'd get a lot of top die-off. The fusarium would strike the vascular tissue, most likely because the growing practice is to strip the leaves off the bottoms of the plants to improve air circulation around the stems, those rooted cuttings, and that damage may have introduced fusarium into the crop. So the poor growing practices from the providers of these plants to begin with. Mites are a problem, especially when the plants are young. One thing that you can do, and one thing that growers did, was to get biological control You could get packets of predatory mites and hang them on the plant or near them, and they were very effective in controlling two-spotted spider mites, which is a problem if you're not careful. We had problems, we had some problems with cucumber beetle. They ended up chewing the leaves, and it wasn't major damage. It was noticeable, especially when the plants were young. By the time the plants got really large, and they did get really large, this was a much less of an issue. What was an issue was the Fusarium crown rot. As soon as we started putting these plants in the ground, we had a lot of rain. This was mid-June. And that rain inundated our fields at Y. Other growers probably weren't managing their irrigation well. And we had a lot of crown rot down at the base of the plants. And it was pretty obvious. In the middle of the day, you'd see the plant leaves, they were drooping. You'd look underneath, and it looked like the bottom of the base of the plant was stripped away, like eaten, or had this white and brown color to it, and basically collapsed vascular tissue. The plants wouldn't last long after that. They were still getting water, but they weren't able to transport nutrients back and forth, and soon after, when the plants got really large, that water that they were able to get from some of the vascular tissue that was still working wasn't enough, and the plants would collapse. We lost around between 5 and 10% of our plants at Y Research because of this, and others also lost about the same. So this is a concern. Towards the end, into August, late August, we had leaf spot disease. Some growers up in central North Maryland, near the PA line, they were getting a lot of leaf spot. We figured it was either Cercospora or Septoria. I do have some samples into Karen Rain, and I'm kind of curious as to what she finds out. I think that she was finding Cercospora in these leaf samples. But it was leaf spot, and it can become quite a problem. It will defoliate the crop, and then the crop won't continue to create the phytochemicals needed. Corn earworm at the end. One of the problems that we had with the corn earworm was that they were eating the flowers. So they would get into the flowers, into the stems. They would do something with the vascular tissue, and then we would have flower death. If you notice here, after that flower death occurred, we'd get botrytis. These flowers are really dense, and because of that density, and because towards the end of September and October we started getting the rain, botrytis became more of an issue with us, and we were getting having a lot of problems with our flower production, especially if you are interested in selling the colas, which are those high-priced flower ends. With this, you couldn't sell it. You get the mold fungus in there, and they would be actually detrimental to humans if it was ingested. Now, these colas are actually being utilized for what we call smokable flower. So yes, you could take these colas off when they were ready, and it takes up until about October when they're dense enough to be removed, to be clipped, and sold as smokable flower. That's something that has a relatively high price to it, interestingly enough. Finally, the other big issue are male plants. Now, the CBD crop, these plants are all female. And these plants are coming from either cuttings or feminized seed. Yeah, the seed can be feminized. You can get a female plants. You apply a certain chemical on these female plants before they start flowering, and that chemical stresses the plant, and they create male flowers. So they become hermaphrodites. And since the female is pollinating itself, the seeds are female. About 95% of them are female. The other 5% are male. And so depending on the quality of the seed, the processes by which the seed was created, sorted, and given to the growers, sold to the growers, some growers only had maybe 5 to 10 plants out of 1,000 had male plants in them. Other growers had 10%. So a lot came down to, I think, the quality of the seed. The problem with males is that if they pollinate the females, you get the seed, that reduces your CBD content. So right after they start flowering in August is when growers have to walk their fields at least twice a week, if not more. Because if they don't pull these male plants out, they're going to, your female plants will get pollinated, you'll get seed, and then you don't have the quality crop that you want. So this is all the way up until September. When we said this is a very labor-intensive crop, this is one of the reasons, apart from actually the harvest. Something you had to keep in mind. So let's talk about the economics. Our growers were promised a lot of money, especially last year when you had outside markets coming in saying you can make a lot of money off an acre of crop. So why is that? When it comes to that biomass, that picture I showed you of that super sack full of the flower and leaf material, the price point that you're making is based on the percent CBD per pound of biomass. That price varies on supply and demand. So right now, the price of this CBD is very low because everyone harvested already. It makes sense. The present price, which comes out monthly, is less than $1 a pound. However, earlier this year, it was up to $4 a pound. Well, what does that mean when it comes to the economics? One of my growers was very helpful in giving me some of his economic data. Kind of back of the napkin calculations, but nonetheless very telling. Now, his average biomass was about 2,000 pounds per acre, dry mass. And so we based kind of this math off of that, thinking that if you grew well, you probably got about 2,000 pounds of biomass off of each acre that you grew. Now the input, the costs associated with growing the crop can vary. It depends on how much input you want to put in. It depends on what kind of growing system you have. It depends on how careful you want to be with the crop. Your fertilization, the equipment you need to fertilize, the equipment that you needed to plant the rows, the labor it takes to manage those rows for weeds. All of these things add up. According to the grower that I got this information from, his first year he spent $14 per dry pound just producing a quality crop. This varies. Some growers aren't putting that much in. It could have a difference on the quality of the crop in the end. But this grower, being a very conscientious one, was very interested in a quality crop, and he put a lot of money into producing it. Harvest, very labor intensive. Again, another $14 that he calculated per dry mass pound. Processing is and I got this from a local processor, about $15 to $20 per pound to process that biomass into CBD. It takes a lot of extraction and concentration and extraction of all of the phytochemicals from the biomass and the distillation of that material that you get into the different components, the terpenes and the cannabinoids. So $15 to $20 per pound processing into CBD. So how this works is the grower has the crop. This is one of the varieties that we used called Bayox. And we tested the CBD content throughout the growing season. We were very curious as to how much time it would take to get to that maximal CBD concentration in